And the interesting thing about that is that it's very replicable. It can be replicated over and over, even to the point that some skeptics have tried to run his experiments. They were expecting to get no results because, of course, they're skeptics. They didn't think it was real. Then they get results, and now they're trying to scurry around and explain them away. It's really amazing.
Why do you suppose there's such a resistance to adopting this worldview and this understanding and allowing it then to transform our world? It seems like if this were common knowledge, it would transform everything in an instant.
Oh, I think it should transform everything in an instant. There's a lot of problems with it. One is something I alluded to already. There's admittedly in the field a social stigma, should we say. And this goes back to the 19th century and even earlier. There's a lot of fraud, unfortunately, in the sense that a lot of people, when they think, for instance, telepathy or thought experiments, they think of, conjuring tricks, stage magicians who basically fake things. Mm-hmm. And as we all know, I hate to mention him, but one of the grand arch skeptics is James Randi, who is a magician, a stage conjurer, and just because he can claim in some cases he can, and it's not always true, but he claims in some cases he can mimic what other people can do, but he's faking it. He's using conjuring tricks. That doesn't mean that everything is a conjuring trick. But, you have that aspect to it. So you have the whole problem of fraud and trying to sort that out. You also have situations where a lot of these phenomena we're talking about, they're very fickle, if I could put it that way. They're hard to produce on command. Mm-hmm. So many of them are very much emotionally laden. In many cases, you get a strong telepathic experience. For instance, when your mother across the continent, maybe thousands of miles away, she gets really sick or she gets injured, and you feel that immediately. Many people have had experiences like that.
Absolutely.
But that's not something you can easily do on command in an experimental situation where you're going to, break people's legs to see if their relatives pick it up. You see what I mean?
Right.
I'm not trying to be facetious, but it really becomes very difficult. It's amazing that we've got to as good and consistent laboratory experiments as we have with things like, the classic card calling experiments where you're trying to send telepathically information like what card are you looking at, what playing card, that type of thing. Because that's very unrealistic from what we know about the natural history, I'll use that term, natural history of these types of phenomena. So it's hard to replicate. Another aspect, not to go on too long, is that we still do not have a good encompassing theory to explain these types of phenomena. That doesn't mean they're not real, but in classical science, if you don't have a good theory, it's much more difficult to make headway among your colleagues that a phenomenon is real. So it becomes very difficult. I'm a geologist. Classic example is continental drift. Mm-hmm. Everyone accepts a version of continental drift now. It's called plate tectonics.
Right.
When it was first proposed in the early 1900s, people were laughed at. It was nonsense. The same thing was happening as with parapsychology and the paranormal now. Couldn't be. Everyone knows that continents can't move because there was no theory to explain how they could move, no mechanism. Now, of course, we have one, and everyone accepts that continents move over geologic time.
Robert, we've got to take another quick break. When we come back, let's talk about remote viewing. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Dreamland. Serious wonder spoken here.
This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with Dr. Robert Schoch, author of the new book, The Parapsychology Revolution, a concise anthology of paranormal and psychical research. Robert, one of our Dreamland hosts, Jim Mars, wrote a book called Sci-Spies, documenting the U.S. Army's formerly top-secret remote viewing unit and how the military has used this psychic ability as a tool and even a weapon during the Cold War. What are your thoughts on remote viewing?
Well, actually, there's definitely something to it. And supplementing what you were just saying, just to plug the book a little bit, we included an article on the same topic by someone in the military who researched it and wrote about it after it was declassified. So it's an incredibly interesting topic, and it was definitely put to good use by the military. There's no question in my mind that remote viewing is real. It can work. The problem is, for military purposes or any other purposes, it doesn't always work as consistently as people would like it to work, and it's subject to interpretation, et cetera, et cetera. It's unclear where it stands right now in the military. Ostensibly, at least some of the programs have been stopped, cut, declassified, but then who knows what programs might be going on that we don't know about that are classified.
And then the marketplace takes over, and you've got some very reputable people teaching remote viewing, and then, of course, you've got the charlatans.
That's right. That's what we were talking about before. You've always got the charlatans. You've always got the frauds. That's the classic thing with remote viewing, or if it's mediums, or, self-proclaimed clairvoyants who want to take advantage of people. Of course, this is no different than any other field.
Right, exactly. Yeah. William Blake once said that if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as infinite. Do you think these our paranormal abilities or natural abilities, which is what they really are, have been brainwashed out of us by a dumbed-down culture?
I think it's been partly brainwashed out of us by a dumbed-down culture. I think there's also a biological component to it.
A survival factor?
A what?
A survival factor?
Yes, a survival factor, because to be honest, remote viewing, telepathy, psychokinesis, any of these phenomena that we're talking about, from a survival point of view, you don't necessarily want to depend on them if you have some other possibility that has a higher level of success. So, for instance, if I'm crossing the street, and this is a silly example, but if I'm crossing the street, I feel more comfortable looking both ways and listening for cars rather than closing my eyes, shutting my ears, and deciding telepathically if someone's driving. Right. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
No, seriously. So, I mean, I know that's a facetious example, but seriously, things like this I think we have to take into account in, again, what I call the natural history of the paranormal phenomena. There are places for it and there are places not for it. So, for instance, it's well documented that some, we'll call them primitive peoples, like the Australian Aborigines, they apparently use telepathy, and this is very well documented, on a regular basis to pick up information from, hundreds of miles away. They don't have their phones. Well, maybe they have cell phones now, who knows?
Right.
But traditionally, when there was nothing else to use, they honed their abilities. They had survival value. But once, the person's in sight, then you just wave your hand or you scream or something. You don't necessarily rely on telepathy at that point.
Kind of an oddball question, but a lot of times when I leave town, I'll take a cab to the airport and a cab home, and I open the door. My two cats, they're sitting right there at the door, right on the counter, right at the door. How do they know I'm home? Well,
they may be applying it. They may be using it. This is maybe similar to things. For instance, there have been studies. Just to throw out another type of instance, where when there are accidents on trains, for instance, it's been found statistically for no reason that we can explain otherwise. A lot of times that day there will be fewer riders on the train than normal. Well, what's going on? One hypothesis is that some level, subconscious, unconscious level, people picked up that there was something wrong, something was going to happen. And short-term precognition is very real, in my opinion. There's a lot of evidence for it. So, people aren't necessarily thinking about consciously, but I think we all have this experience sometimes. You just don't do something, or you do something, and you don't know exactly why, or you don't even think about it. It's a very low fundamental level. And sometimes, people fumble with their keys, or they they spill